Chad has become the latest African nation to walk away from the International Criminal Court, following Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger out the door. N'Djamena says a review of the court's record since 2002 found its effectiveness limited and uneven, and pointed out that 9 of the 13 investigations that the ICC has opened concern African states, which is a pattern, a pattern it and other departing governments read as bias rather than coincidence. But Chad's exit lands against a messier backdrop, than a simple sovereignty stand. It comes as Washington openly pushes member states to quit the court. And while Chad faces its own allegations of funneling weapons into Sudan's civil war. Joining us on this particular conversation, we have Christopher Isike, Professor of African Politics and International Relations in Pretoria, South Africa. We also have Achike Chude. He is African Affairs Analyst in Kigali, Rwanda. We have Donald Deya, CEO, Pan-African Lawyers Union in Arusha, Tanzania. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us at this time. All right, so let me begin with Christopher. Christopher, speak to us, because the court just lost its chief prosecutor, which is Karim Khan, to misconduct allegations on top of, chronic non-cooperation from member states. What are your thoughts on African nations, quietly and silently leaving the ICC? How much of this current wave of withdrawals is about principle, and how much is about the ICC simply looking weak right now?
A combination of a number of the factors, and I would interpret the withdrawals at 3 interconnected levels. One is the domestic, the implication that this has for Africa in terms of increasing the autonomy of military-led governments, like you have in the Sahel, that reduce an important source of external scrutiny that the ICC represents, right? And this is especially the case if these countries that are leaving do not advocate for and actively pursue an alternative to the ICC. The second level is the fact that these withdrawals reinforce, in the case of the Alliance of Sahelian States, their project of sovereignty, recognition of their own form of regionalism, and its political separation from ECOWAS and Western-backed institutional arrangements. And of course, at the systematic level, they reflect a wider crisis of legitimacy, confronting international institutions in an increasingly multiplex world, as Professor Acharya would say. Now, the greatest danger for Africa is not necessarily the weakening of the ICC itself. It is the possibility that the legitimate critique of unequal international justice becomes a justification for less justice, like I said, especially if there is no alternative. So if African states replace the ICC with stronger domestic and continental accountability mechanisms, then of course the present crisis could contribute to the decolonization and localization of international criminal justice. But if they withdraw without constructing credible alternatives, the principal beneficiaries will be these governments and armed actors that are capable of committing atrocities with diminished fear of accountability, while the principal losers eventually will become the ordinary African citizens. So this is the paradox that these withdrawals represent for the continent.
Okay, so let's come to Donald. Donald, Chad actually says that its review found that the ICC's record limited and uneven after 20 years. Can you walk us through that? What specifically changed what do you think changed for Chad between when it joined in 2006, and its decision to leave this July? What changed for them?
It is hard to get into the mind of a politician anywhere in the world, and it's certainly hard to get into the mind of an African politician. And with all of these states, if you look at the African states, as Christopher said, that have withdrawn their support over the last 1 year, that's Burkina, Mali, Niger, and then lately Chad. If you look at all of these states, one needs to separate between what the ruling regime or administration says the country wants and what the people want. Because in a lot of these things, it is the ruling clique that are the ones that have single-handedly orchestrated this withdrawal, even without consulting Parliament. Yet, most of them required parliamentary approval to ratify to join in the first place. So I think what has changed is, as Chris said, there's an overwhelming attitude of authoritarianism that's creeping over many parts of the world, democratic regression, including in Africa. In each of these countries, Burkina, Mali, Niger, and Chad, what you have is literally a military junta that took over power in a military coup d'etat. In the case of Chad, it was a shooting of the then President Idriss Deby and controversial circumstances in which his son Mahamat Deby then takes power. So it's about self-preservation of the ruling elite, rather than that it is objectively in the interests of the citizens that they withdraw. Citizens, when they are asked across the board, if you look at Afrobarometer surveys and so on, when they're asked, they actually want more accountability, more justice, both within the continent and beyond the continent. So this is something that our leaders want, rather than what we, the people, want.
All right. Now, Achike, do you agree with, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger when they call the court an instrument of neo-colonial repression? Does the court's actual case record back that rhetoric, or is it doing political work for military governments that have their own reasons to avoid outside scrutiny?
Well, the question to ask is, at what point did they realize that it is an instrument of, Western imperialism or neocolonialism? Especially, of course, you could say that maybe under the civilian dispensation, these countries signed onto the Rome agreement setting up the International Criminal Court. And you could also say, because normally, it is said that governance is a continuum, but because this is a different kind of governance that does not respond to the ideals of democracy, more or less, it is not even as if the governments that they replaced in the first place also succumbed to the ideals of, or operated within the framework of democratic societies. But then the argument could be made that they are military juntas and that they do not answer to anybody, including even the citizens themselves. So if they come out with, this kind of definition about the relationship that their countries have with the International Criminal Court as instruments of neocolonialism and all that, well, that is their own definition. They are the ones that are running their countries, and people cannot question them. But the truth has to be told. Of course, the issues of accusation of bias and all of that, we cannot dispense with these accusations, because we have seen what has been going on in other parts of the world. Of course, if you look at the violation of international law, by certain countries, you talk about the first Gulf War, you talk about the second Gulf War, built up on trumped-up charges and all that. Then, of course, people would readily tell you with the number of people that died in those places that the perpetrators of that war in the United States, that are even Britain and some of these other countries, should be subject to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And it is not as if once you because you need to make this clarification, it is not as if once you opt out of the International Criminal Court, you can no longer be subject to the influence your country of the reach of the International Criminal Court, because a member state can refer certain happenings or occurrences in your state to the ICC, and then they can decide that they might want to investigate, or the United Nations itself can also do the same thing. But I think that, like my colleagues have said in the studio, yes, you want to whip up sentiment, on anti-colonialism and all that. But the reality is that these are self-serving, exercises by some of these juntas. Obviously, there have been accusations about killings of Africans, within their own territories, especially in the fight against insurgency, Boko Haram, and all of these extremist groups. So there have been constant accusations that of high-handed actions by the military junta in those countries against their own citizens. So obviously, this will be an attempt to escape greater scrutiny, from the International Criminal Court.
Okay.
But as far lastly, whether there is the accusations against, them, like the ICC, for lopsided application of international law when it comes to violations, I think there's a lot of truth in it too, if you look at that closely.
Okay. So let's come back to Christopher, because Chad complained that 9 of the court's 13 investigations have targeted African states. And Chad's foreign minister confirmed a phone call in which a U.S. Deputy Secretary of the State raised concerns about the ICC and urged Chad to review its accession. Rubio's State Department also has openly called on more of the 125 member states to follow Chad's lead. So how much of this decision is really Chad's own and how much of it is Washington's? And what does it tell us about the world's most powerful non-member actively campaigning for others to leave?
Well, look, there is a sense in which they can make the case about decolonization, like everyone else, has been saying. But that argument has become weakened. Remember also that before now, the one case example of a country that has actually left the court in Africa is Burundi. I think that was in 2016 or 2017. And then South Africa also followed in 2016 where they served notice to leave the court, and then they reinstated that decision in 2017, a year later, just before the notice was to kick in. The point I'm making is that the argument that the courts have over-concentrated on Africa kind of falls away when you look at the fact that an African country, South Africa, has taken a top country, a big power in the case of Israel, to the ICJ, and that case has been gaining traction. So that means that the idea that it targets only Africa or works for a selective justice that works for the weak and not so for the powerful may not be entirely correct. Now, the idea also that the United States is pushing this agenda is not surprising, considering that the United States itself, especially under President Trump 1.0 and more so in his second term now 2.0, the United States that has benefited from a rules-based international system that it helped to put in place is actively, dismantling that rules-based international system. And it will not be surprising that it will want to actively encourage other countries to do the same and help to push forward the argument of delegitimizing the International Criminal Court. So these are all examples of the kind of fragmentation we're seeing in the global system, the diffusion of power across different sources, and all underscoring the need for us to rethink and move towards a new world order, one that Africa should have a say in terms of establishing the ground norms that will define that world order.
Okay. So I'm being told that Adib Saani has actually joined us. He is Executive Director, Jatikay Centre, Foreign Policy and Security Analyst in Accra, Ghana. Thank you so much, Adib, for joining. So let's hear your thoughts on all of this, because this announcement comes while Chad faces accusations from Sudanese officials and rights groups of facilitating weapons shipments to the Rapid Support Forces, that's the RSF. So is the timing a coincidence? Or is this withdrawal about shielding Chad from future scrutiny?
Well, thank you so much. It's about a lot. I spoke with some friends I have living in the Sahel, and some of them were so in favor of their various countries' decision to leave the ICC. It's a matter of national pride for them. Some see it as sort of a protest against the international system, and they also link it to preserving their sovereignty, because it has to be all about them, including their justice system, and not rely on justice from outside of the country. But my co-panelists have said a lot, and I agree to a very large extent that a lot of it has to do with accountability. According to the Global Terrorism Index, the Sahel region is responsible for 50% of all terrorist attacks across the world. It has become the epicenter of the fight against terrorism. A country such as Mali is dealing with terrorist groups such as Jenim, and also dealing with the Azawas, who was their Republic of Azawad. Burkina Faso is also fighting these terrorists. Recently, their defense minister was in Accra when he signed a defense pact of some sort with the Ministry of Defense here in Accra. We do know, and based on work I have done in the past, that look, government soldiers have committed a lot of crimes, extrajudicial killings, and in some cases, hand over weapons to civilians called volunteers. For example, in Burkina Faso, they are called the VDPs. In Mali too, some have been given arms. And these civilians who have been given arms to protect their communities operate just like the jihadists, okay? So I think that to run away from accountability is one of the reasons these countries have decided to leave the ICC. And one of the co-panelists asked a very profound question. When did they realize that this is neo-colonialist in nature? So it goes way beyond what they are making it look like. There are definitely some deeper underlying issues.
All right, so let me quickly come to Donald, because we actually have little time. I'll give you 2 minutes, Donald. Speak to us, because 33 African states have chosen to stay. So what is the strongest argument, you've heard from a government that's had every reason to leave but chose to stay?
I think my colleague who spoke just before me brought out the problem that whereas there are problems in various parts of the world, and we agree, there's none of the states and none of the situations that are currently before the ICC from Africa that are there by mistake or that are there wrongly. We've got serious crimes going on in the continent. And of course, we're working on our own mechanisms. The African Union itself passed a legal instrument which has not achieved enough ratification, but would give the African Court on Human and People's Rights an international criminal jurisdiction, actually wider than the Rome Statute. But our states have not ratified it yet. Only Angola has. We need at least 14 more for it to come into force. So we tell those that rule over us that you can't have your cake and eat it too. And as for us as citizens, we are in a sick continent and we need all the medicine we can get. The fact that you have a national referral hospital in your capital city does not mean you don't need one at the province. The fact that you have one at the province does not mean you don't need a district hospital. The fact that you have a district hospital does not mean you don't need a clinic down the road. The fact that you have a clinic down the road does not mean you don't need a pharmacy in front of your gate. So we need strong national systems, strong regional systems, continental and global systems that assure accountability. And ICC is part of the mix, despite the problems it has. Thank you.
All right, so let me quickly hear from Achike. Achike, let's hear your final thoughts, because rights groups are calling for reform rather than an exit. So addressing the perspective or the perception of selective justice head on is what they are asking. What would a credible reform look like? And does the court have the political capital left to deliver it? In 1 minute, please.
Well, I think that has to be done because obviously I sense that members of this panel, some of us speaking here, I'm not sure there's anybody that is speaking in favor of total extrication from the International Criminal Court. So that's the drive now to, especially by the United States and Israel, the constant attack also signals, and then the fact that African countries are moving towards, going away from the ICC is an indication that serious reforms, are needed. But again, the question you also have to ask yourself is the issue of African political leadership, the lack of political will among virtually every country in the continent. So there is no desire for them to do the right thing. And that is the greatest obstacle, really, when it comes to even setting up a regional court to also do what the ICC is supposed to do. So in Africa, we've kept on talking about the rise of strong men and the consistency of the rule of strong men in the continent rather than strong institutions. If we had strong institutions, then I think perhaps some of us would move towards believing that, yes, Africa can solve the issues of all the atrocities, punishing people behind perpetrating most of the atrocities in the continent. So that reform is something I think everybody in every country needs to move towards very serious reform, and then look inwards to see how some of these issues can be looked at and resolved.
Okay. All right. I think with that, we will be wrapping up the show. But thank you so much, gentlemen. Adib, I wish we had more time with you, but, we will definitely look forward to speaking with you on something, a different story or this particular development later. Thank you, Christopher Isike, Professor of African Politics and International Relations, Pretoria, South Africa. We've also had Achike Chude, African Affairs Analyst in Kigali, Rwanda. Adib Saani, Executive Director, Jatikay Centre, Foreign Policy and Security Analyst in Accra, Ghana. And we had Donald Deya, CEO, Pan-African Lawyers Union, Arusha, Tanzania. Thank you once again.